Hello again. My name is Dennis Domer, and welcome again to Biography of a City, Lawrence. This is the 6th session of our class, which we're presenting at the University of Kansas. We have two very interesting sessions tonight on universities in Lawrence, which have been a very significant part of our biography. Our first speaker is Kathryn Nimz Tuttle, who grew up in Oberlin, Kansas, and received both her bachelor's and her doctoral degrees from KU. Her research focuses on the history of higher education, particularly women in higher education. And she is currently director of the Freshman-Sophomore Advising Center at KU. She has been at KU for 10 years. Previously, she served as director of new student orientation and as acting director of admissions. And her son Isa will be a freshman this next fall at KU. She has lived in Lawrence for 25 years and is certainly one of the important people in its history. Thank you for coming tonight, Kathryn.
Thank you, Professor Domer. I'm pleased to be here. Good evening. I'm very glad to talk with you tonight about KU as a place in Lawrence's history. There are many issues that we could discuss in the short time that we have available. I've decided to make tonight's discussion very much a visual one for you, and so we'll be spending most of our time looking at the visual history of the University of Kansas. But I would like to mention first a few points about having a university like the University of Kansas in Lawrence. First point would be location and place. The KU campus is 1,000 acres in the center of Lawrence. Its location on Mount Oread is significant. It is so near and yet so far. I talked to many graduates of places like Lawrence High School who are planning to come to the university and has barely been on campus. If you've ever tried to traverse the city from north to south, you can't get there from here. You have to drive over Mount Oread, and sometimes, and most times, we won't let you do that. Those of us who work on the Hill, as opposed to those who work downtown or at Sallie Mae or at FMC, may seldom cross paths. And then there is the contradiction of KU in Lawrence and in Kansas. We certainly have the stereotype of Snob Hill, the elite intellectual life in a populous state like Kansas, where higher education was perceived as an extension of the public school ideal, and where students paid no tuition, which would be a pleasant thought for all of you and your parents today. A second point would be the town-gown relationship itself, which I mentioned in the title of the talk tonight. Yet, in my opinion, I don't think KU has a town and gown problem with Lawrence. One hears of other universities or colleges in college towns that have many more significant conflicts between the people of the town and the people of the university. I think it does have a town and gown problem with Topeka and with the rest of Kansas when we look at the legislative functions and with perceptions of KU, especially rural and western Kansas. One evidence of this is the new plan to reorganize the Board of Regents into the Kansas Council of Higher Education. This has many implications for the university and is largely an issue being decided in Topeka. One aspect of the town-gown relationship is important to mention, and that is that for many years, KU has ignored its relationships and its responsibilities with the other important higher education institution in this community, Haskell Indian Nations University, which you'll learn more about tonight. And pleased to see that in recent years there have been improvements in that relationship. And thirdly, there's the simple economic impact. The University of Kansas is the largest employer in the city. There's also, of course, the students' impact on the city's economy. It's a two-way street. Lawrence provides key services for the university, such as firefighting, and there's much overlap in political leadership as well, from city commissioners who are KU faculty to newspaper publishers who chair major boards of the university. So we're connected in many ways, even if sometimes that connection is less obvious. Now, my own research has focused on educational history, primarily women in higher education and student life, and so you'll see a lot of that in what I talk about tonight as opposed to perhaps the governance or political structures. And the focus on this evening will be on the reminders of KU's history, its place in the city, the campus, the students, the faculty, and the staff that have lived and worked on the Hill. Can I have the first slide, please? And I hear you've seen this lovely picture of Mount Oread before. You know, I have to stop and say a minute that we could all be in Manhattan, Kansas right now, and I probably wouldn't even have a place on this program tonight, and that's because the very beginning of this university, of course, was connected with a lot of economic demands for having the state university in one's own town. And we have the high idealism of the New England transplants in this community who held up a university as needed. But at the same time, there were many economic factors asking for the state university in Lawrence. As well as Clifford Griffin pointed out, the pro-slavery factions also called for a college, which they were wanting to call the Kansas Territorial University in Lawrence. So it wasn't mere high idealism that brought Lawrence a university. There were Free Staters in Manhattan and Emporia that were interested in having the state university there. Well, in 1861, the new Kansas State Legislature passed a bill for the state university to be in Manhattan, which is obviously much better centrally located. And we were saved by a veto of Governor Charles Robinson, who happened to live in Lawrence. And we were also saved by the Morrill Act, M-O-R-R-I-L-L, of 1862, the first significant federal legislation regarding higher education. The Morrill Act established in each state existing at the time an agricultural and mechanic arts college. We would call that an engineering college today. In each state for the liberal and practical education of the masses. That's the Morrill Act of 1862. And Manhattan became the location of the Agricultural and Mechanic Arts College in our state. It was originally called the Kansas Agricultural College. Well, Lawrence thought it had it made. Now they have a state university in Lawrence. The legislators were still unconvinced, and apparently the Lawrence legislator paid $5 bribes to other legislators to encourage the passing of the bill that placed the University of Kansas in Lawrence. So with just a little bit of luck, perseverance, and bribery, we're here in Lawrence tonight instead of Manhattan, Kansas. What we see with the, if I could have the slide again of the first slide again, if I can have the pointer, some of you may already recognize these locations here, but where I have the arrow here at this side of the fence is about where the campanile is now. And at the center, about right here, you would find Lippincott and Bailey Halls, to give you some sense of perspective here. This is the 1867 Alexander Gardner photo of Mount Oread. Of course, you probably already know it's such a melodious name before. It was Hogback Ridge, or even Devil's Backbone. Walt Whitman comment about the place was that it was a broad expanse of living green, which is a nice way to think about this prairie, really. But as early as 1866, 67, 500 trees were planted on this barren hill. The ad in the Junction City Union of September 9th, 1866 has several important things to say about what the institution was intended to be. Now, you will note here that they asked for $10 of tuition for preparatory courses and $30 for college classes, but later in the century, tuition was removed entirely, and the university really was seen as this extension of the public school. Soldiers' orphans were admitted free. This was from the Amos Lawrence Fund that helped after Quantrill's raid, and incidentally, that same fund placed Lawrence, the university in Lawrence, so it was also partly due to the relief fund that we are here in Lawrence. But the most important thing here to notice, I think, is the statement, both sexes will be admitted to all departments of the university. There was quite a controversy about this that also affected the attitudes toward not having any restrictions based on race. The initial charter of the university calls for a, quote, female branch, but I believe what happened is that the economic concerns of the day and the problems of setting up two completely different branches of the university, fortunately, in my opinion, kept them from doing that. And according to my research, the University of Kansas is the second state public university in the country to admit women to the same program of study as men. And that last part is important, the same program of study. Iowa University was the first in 1855, and then KU in 1866. Universities that are more well known perhaps in this area, like Michigan and Wisconsin, admit until later. For the most part, women students were put into either a female college or a normal school, which was used for teacher education. Now, on September 12, 1866, 26 women and 28 men walked up this hill. It must have been quite an adventure. This is North College, which was built on the foundation of Lawrence University, which was started by the Presbyterians in 1859 and never finished due to lack of funds. North College has different scenes in the winter. One nice thing about this slide is the woman on the left side of the screen with her large hat and heavy coat. And another interesting perspective of North College that you may have seen, again, this is a photograph by Gardner. He used a long focal length of his lens, and it brings the river and the city much closer to North College than is of course, actually true. In 1872, this class of students, 6 females, 6 males, an average age of 18. At this time, as Griffin commented, KU was merely a preparatory school for a non-existent college. Sometimes it's hard to remember or understand that at this time there were no high schools, there were no secondary schools in the state of Kansas or throughout most of the country. Students were going through preparatory programs on their own, and most of the students admitted to KU in 1866 were still in the preparatory program. Not even by 1910, only about 20% of those attending school in the United States were in high school. Only about 20% of all people in school ever attended high school, so it was not common to have this experience. Chancellor Oliver, the first chancellor, bemoaned that quality and training of future students was so uncertain, we might as well go camping on the prairie as try to write a course of study. And the first graduating class subsequently until 1873. So when I talk to students and their parents are worried about them not graduating in 4 years, you can tell them that the first class at KU took even longer. The first valedictorian was Flora Richardson, looking rather severe here. I think it was a tough program of study for her. She also went on to get a master's degree in 1876. And here we have the first 3 faculty of the university. On your left is Frank Snow, who went on to become the chancellor of the university in 1890. The center person, Eliel Rice, because of his age, was named the chair of the faculty, but the other 2 faculty found him, quote, intellectually incompetent and personally uncongenial. And they got rid of him and sent him to Baker, Professor Domer, and that's where he ended up. Now, David Robinson on the right was our first arts and sciences dean, so 2 of these faculty had quite long tenures at the university, and as far as I can tell, he was also the person to break the consenting relations policy at the University of Kansas. He married one of only 2 students in the college course in 1869. Now, one thing you do find in the research is that the Board of Regents did seem to have a concern for having women faculty. Even very early in the university, we had our first female instructor in 1867, but our first full professor was Elizabeth Leonard, pictured here in her lovely dress. She was a professor of modern languages, drawing, and painting. She was also a classmate of Sarah Robinson, who was the wife of Governor Charles Robinson. So there were many connections with some of the faculty we had here. She toured Europe twice. She was known for her grand manner and her enthusiasm in the classroom. John Fraser, the chancellor from 1867 to 1874, brought many important things to the campus. A diverse curriculum. He wanted sciences and modern languages involved, and he also was, of course, instrumental in getting the construction of the first major hall on the campus. But he was forced out by faculty who disagreed with his attitude and point of view. He was interestingly replaced by a gentleman named Stephen Carpenter of the University of Wisconsin in 1874. Now, Professor Carpenter decided to arrive in Lawrence in the middle of August when it was about 100 degrees. He got off the train in the train station and looked up, and also, in addition to the heat, saw the grasshoppers, because this was during a period of time of a great grasshopper invasion. He took one look, he turned around, got back on the train, and went back to Wisconsin. He didn't talk to any of the regents or any of the people there to greet him, and simply wrote a letter saying he declined. James Marvin was then named the chancellor, and an interesting link for him is that he was the first superintendent of Haskell in 1804. Now, the hall that bears Fraser's namesake was called University Hall. It was built in 1872. One of the senses that you get from some of these older photographs, too, is this hill still is very much the prairie. I mean, it's, and imagine seeing this from a distance. It was a very grand place. The funds were provided by bonds floated by the city of Lawrence. So again, that connection of the financial stability for the university initially coming from the center, from the city. I like this slide from the late 19th century. It's actually from the 1898 Souvenir History of Lawrence, because you see Fraser Hall there off at the distance and see some of the, in this picture as opposed to the earlier one we saw, it's very far away. It's very distant. It's on Mount Oread and the hill so far away. At the very extreme right of this slide, you will see the Eldridge Hotel. I want to talk a little about some of the early faculty, and Byron Caldwell Smith was one of the most important. Byron Caldwell Smith. He was a professor of Greek literature and languages from 1872 to 75. He was described as a philosophical idealist and a religious pantheist, which, as you can imagine, in 19th century Kansas went over very well. He had quite significant European travel, and he was seen as the most brilliant member of the faculty, even though he was only 24 when he was first named to the faculty. Now, again, he had a little problem with the consenting relationships policy. He fell in love with one of his students as well, Kate Stevens, who later served as professor of Greek literature and language and was the first person in the United States to chair a department of Greek. Under her photograph, written in cursive, is this statement: "What men dare, I dare. What men dare, I dare." She fell in love with Smith as an undergraduate, but he unfortunately, tragically, in 1877, in the month they were to be married. Now, Kate was the daughter of a prominent judge named Nelson Stevens, and she had a number of conflicts when she was a professor here with Chancellor Lippincott. Lippincott was not altogether favorable toward women on the faculty. She asked for a raise and more instructors. She got into conflict with the Board of Regents and was fired in 1885. She cited her gender, her lack of religious orthodoxy, and the possibility of a vendetta against her father, who had made an unpopular decision from the bench as reasons for her dismissal. She had quite a varied life. She traveled with Susan B. Anthony, and she spent most of her life in New York City working as an editor for publishers like Harper's. She returned to Lawrence, however, to retire and died at 85, and she's buried at Oak Hill Cemetery on East 15th Street. But she did pave the way for faculty such as Hannah Oliver, pictured here, who is a professor of Latin for over 40 years. And the fact that the university had a woman regent was very unusual. Cora M. Downs was the first woman regent at a state university. She was appointed by Governor St. John in 1881. She was a noted journalist in the state. Unfortunately, politics again gets in the way. We get a new governor elected, a Governor Glick, who opposed women on the board and women involved with any higher education institutions. She served only 2 years. Now, one reason we may remember Cora M. Downs is that she has a namesake, who is her granddaughter, who was the first woman to receive a PhD in bacteriology at the university. And she became one of the most internationally known microbiologists and served at the university for many years. That's Cora M. Downs. Now, just for a little picture, and I know this is hard to read, of the curriculum, it was a very classical curriculum. The first students in the first year would take Latin, Greek, algebra, geometry, Grecian and Roman history. If you're a woman, they'd let you substitute the French language for Greek. But it was a very challenging curriculum, but lest you think the students were completely bored, and yeah, if we could get this all the way. This is Professor Snow with his students on an expedition to Colorado in 1889, and you'll notice that there are 4 female students here as well. On the extreme left is a student named William Allen White, and he was an undergraduate here. His mother moved to Lawrence with him to take care of his housekeeping, and he also enjoyed his trip to Colorado. The students could have fun. These are some students on the steps of Spooner Hall with some interesting hats and quizzical expressions. This library was the first library of the university, and it was given Spooner of Boston. who was a great uncle of Chancellor Snow. So you continue to see that Lawrence, Massachusetts connection there. This is the class of 1895 on the steps of Old Snow, one of our beautiful departed buildings. It's interesting to note here that I think at least 3 African American students are visible. The first were admitted in 1870. The first graduate was in 1885, Blanche Bruce, who was the principal of Sumner School in Leavenworth for 54 years. Now, students had many issues with housing. There were no dormitories at this time. For the most part, students would take housing in the Oriad neighborhood in boarding houses. The interesting thing about this student's room here is, if you'll note on the bureau to the right, there are 13 photographs of his girlfriends. A very popular thing were boarding clubs. Students would bound together and form a boarding house club where they would live together. This particular boarding club was on Ohio Street, and it was run by Gertrude and Cora Becker, who were sisters, and they're on the top row on the back left there. Another thing to note is this is co-ed. This is co-educational living. And certainly the proprieties of the day probably didn't have the students living in rooms together, but they would share a same house together. And of course, the other thing that came in to provide students some both social lives and housing were fraternities and sororities. This is Psi Upsilon. It's a fraternity that no longer exists on campus, but this is a picture from 1886. The first fraternity was Beta Theta Pi in 1873. The women followed shortly thereafter with sororities. This is Kappa Kappa Gamma, which still exists, and this is a photo from 1891. Not to be outdone, they had mandolin clubs. And then, of course, they had inter-athletics. And this is the first football team from 1891. Notice the interesting caps that the men wear. If you look at the ball that the man holds in the center, I think you can see it's a little more rounded. It doesn't look like our footballs of today. The baseball team was actually our first intercollegiate sport, and it played for the first time in 1880 and lost a game to Washburn. This picture was actually taken a little bit later in 1894. And I just had to put this one in for the dog. Obviously, the baseball team here in 1903 has their own mascot. And for those of you who love baseball, you can notice the difference in the gloves and some of the other things that are obvious there with this team. And of course, we have to have basketball. I do have a little bit of a quibble about this 100-year, though, because the actual first game was not played until 1899, although the team actually formed in 1898. And of course, we have James here on the upper right corner. And it appears to me that they are borrowing uniforms from the football team. Now, of course, many of you know that Naismith had the one piece of notoriety about him, which is that he is the only losing basketball coach that KU's ever had as the inventor of the game. He was much more interested in it, I think, as physical recreation and physical education. That was his major focus of study and work. But here I just wanted to show you him involved with the 1923 undefeated basketball team with coaches Fogg Allen and James Naismith in the center. And at the back, left-hand side, is Adolph Rupp, who went on to coaching glory at Kentucky. So certainly, I like the socks too. I think it's, they're... Now, not to be outdone, the women were involved in many different sporting activities. Here we see the Women's Tennis Club of 1892. Many of you would like to get on the courts with those kinds of dresses, but they did. And the women's basketball team. And this is from the 1920s. Now, Naismith also coached the women's basketball team for a period of time. When he talked about it later, he remembered some of the negatives. They wore high-heeled shoes and bustles. It was a mess. So having basketball and physical education at a time when women had a lot more restrictions on their dress was obviously challenging. But he continued his enjoyment of the female athletes, and here he is with the fencing club in 1926. Now, on the other side, the cheerleading squad looked a little different back then. These are the male cheerleaders for the football team in 1899, and this was from McCook Field, which was the football field at the time. Now, Naismith also was very intent on gymnastics. Robinson Gym was built and is now was located in about the spot that Wesco Hall now. The interesting thing about this, if you can see it clearly enough, is the poor young man who's upside down appears to have a very red face, and I'm not sure how long he's been there, but he looks like he's about ready to pass out. And here we have the entire university in 1893, faculty and students, and you can see there handwritten at the top, they were already doing the Rock Chalk chant. In 1902, we start to get a glimpse of the campus as it was, and unfortunately will never be again. The buildings here, starting on the left, are Spooner Hall. To the back left, that is Old Blake, then Fraser, and then, of course, the Natural History Museum, or Dyke. Dyke Hall has many favorite things to it. Of course, you've seen these up on the building. These are called, actually, they're not gargoyles. As I understand it, they're actually called grotesque, which are don't have water flowing through them, but they're placed all over the building. And, of course, the Natural History Museum gets its name from Lewis Lindsay Dyke, a very well-known naturalist and explorer. If you've seen the panorama there, you probably know that it was developed by him for the Chicago World's Fair of 1893. Now, Dyke also taught the anatomy classes, and don't think that students and faculty then did not have a sense of humor. If you look to the right, you'll see that the teacher of the class is a skeleton. Now, this is an interesting vision of the university. This is an architect's plan for the campus in 1904. And if I could have the pointer, please, since it's kind of small. This is Strong Hall as it was envisioned. It looks somewhat similar to what we see it today. But this is Strong Hall facing north to the bottom. This is north down here. So they had a vision for the campus that would have been expanded in the exact opposite direction as the way it expanded. And that it is true that the entering doors to Strong were originally envisioned on the opposite side, where the parking garage is now. And another interesting aspect of this development was in 1903, an electric railroad company had a plan to go around the stadium, basically in this kind of a manner, down Mississippi Street here. The stadium would have been over here, up and around, and tunnel through Mount Oread, and come out on the other side, on the west and south sides of the campus, and have real estate developments in that side of the campus. And does it have a familiar ring at all? Traffic ways. At any rate, the KU got wind of this, quickly bought up some of the land on the south and west side of the campus and prevented a tunnel at least through. Now by 1904, we have the university expanded. We have schools of pharmacy, engineering, law, education, and fine arts, and a 2-year medical school in Kansas City. And the campus is still very bucolic. These are cows near Potter Lake with a portion of Strong Hall in the background. And Daisy Hill really got its name from daisies. These are children of Professor William Griffith, who was an art professor on Daisy Hill. Another view, again, we're still on the prairie in this view of the campus in 1906. And the transition with the chancellors at this time. On your left is Chancellor Lippincott, who served from 1883. In the center is Strong, who was just being inaugurated in 1902 at the time of this picture. And on the right is Chancellor Snow, who served starting in 1890. Now, as we move further into the 20th century, we find many modern things coming to campus, and I wish we had. These are the electric streetcars that were on campus from 1910 to 1933. They started in Lawrence the year before. They came up Mississippi Street by Bailey and down across the other side of the hill. If you can see, there's an ad, it may be hard to see, for Ober's, which was a clothing store in Lawrence. It's on one side. And then the other thing, which if you can show me the pointer, yeah, it's right there, which is, they had a little piece on that in the paper just the other day. And then if you could bring that back out, you'll see something else new on campus, which were the lights. And those were newly installed at this time. Another new thing that was happening at this time was women's suffrage. And this was a photograph taken, some of you may have seen it, on Vermont Street. The woman in the back of the car with the dark suit is Mrs. Strong, the wife of the chancellor, who was a proponent of women's suffrage. And, I want to go back one, sorry, to talk just a little bit more about this. The Kansas State Federation of Women's Clubs was interested in not only in suffrage but on conditions for women on the campus, and they were the ones who proposed for the first time to have what we would call a dean of women. At the time it was called an advisor to women. And the first one at KU was in 1913. Her name was Florence Marley Brown, and she had served as president of this statewide federation. In the catalog, her goal was to act as, quote, a mother to young women away from home. Well, the students had different ideas about the mothering they might need, and this is a drawing by a student who did a lot of wonderful drawings for KU named Henry Malloy. He's the one who drew the first long-legged jayhawk. It's really a favorite of mine. And these are some descriptions he has of students at KU in 1912, including in the upper left the raw material, the right the grind, and at the bottom center with the dog, the rah-rah type. Now, students were into a lot of things in the 1900s early, and this was one of their favorite pastimes. This was the annual maypole scrap. This is the one from 1900. You can see Fraser in the background. These had been held since 1891. They were battles, they were fist fights, they were brawls between the men of the freshman class and the men of the sophomore class over raising their class flag. And the chancellor and faculty became so concerned about this, they decided a little feminization was necessary. So they moved from the maypole scrap to the May Day Fete, or festival. And here we see these lovely ladies in 1911. This is one of my favorite photos of old KU. And this was the May Day Festival in 1908. Looking south toward the Wakarusa Valley with the old Blake Hall there in the background. And as you can see, it really was a community event, and if you look closely, there's both horse and buggies there as well as cars. So this was 1908. Another way they dealt with some of the fighting that was going on with the students, hazing was an everyday part of life for many freshmen. Freshmen were required to wear beanies, and this continued through World War II. But the administration got so concerned that they finally encouraged students to form kinds of student governments. The first organized government really was Women's Panhellenic in 1910. The Interfraternity Council followed the next year, and then in 1912 we finally had a campus-wide student government. So the student government originally was encouraged by the administration to control the behavior of students. Another thing that they did, oh, and this one I just have to throw in, 1911. I think this is the commencement regatta, and I think this is definitely ripe for an Impressionist painting. It's at Potter's Lake. The other technique that was used to try to quiet the men down was in place of the fights, they would have something called a nightshirt parade. I have no idea where this came from, and the symbolism is a little too heavy for me to really get into right here. But mostly the fraternity guys would put on their nightgowns and parade around town, and they would end up at the chancellor's house and do what they called a peace jubilee. I don't know if it was a song or what it was, but this went on through the 1950s. I have one more of these later. One thing you might want to notice on the left-hand side of the photograph, if you could bring that in a little bit, there's obviously some young boys here and that are, I'm sorry, take it out a little bit, that are from Lawrence. And I think this interaction of younger children on the campus or young boys on the campus is something that you'll see in other cases as well. Well, something else would happen in the 1910s that obviously would have a effect on the university. Here we have students with their wooden training rifles. This is 1918, and World War I is here. About 500 students had enlisted the previous year to be a part of the campaign in Europe. And right on the campus, the Student Army Training Corps barracks were built. The building you see on the right is Marvin Hall. Some of you may have seen on PBS last week a very interesting story, a piece on the influenza epidemic of 1918. The influenza epidemic hit Lawrence and it hit KU. And 32 students died on this campus. Over 750 were ill. A third of the students that died were from this SATC camp. Women also got involved with war work, but when they asked the women to be involved with the 6 a.m. drill in commiseration with the male enlistees, they refused. After the war, we're using some of the technology from that war. This is the first area of the campus, and you see Strong Hall in the center. And here we have Jayhawk Boulevard again, looking a little better with some paving on the streets and brick sidewalks. Now this is one of my favorite views of the campus. This was taken in 1928. And at this point, Strong Hall had been completed, and to the far right is actually the completion of Hoke. I think when we see what's happened to the campus with the destruction of several important buildings, the symmetry that you see here has been lost. And it's quite a grand view of the campus. Also in 1927, we have Hoke Auditorium dedicated. The Kansas Memorial Union in 1927, there were 2 memorials to students who lost their lives in World War I. The Union was one, and the football stadium, the Memorial Stadium, the oldest stadium still in use, continuous use west of the Mississippi, and they're renovating it, so I guess it's time. 2 memorials to World War I. If you want to take a close look, you can still find the cupola there. It's hard to see, but it's still in the current building. Other important buildings in the 1920s and an important personage, and if you could bring this one, pull it back out a little bit. On the far left is Carrie Watson, the original librarian for the university, who served over 30 years. She began in 1887. She had many battles with Chancellor Lindley, was charged with inefficiency, and even after giving all those years to the university, when they attempted to give the name of the building to her, Chancellor Lindley protested. But the alumni agreed to do it, and I won't have an argument about her efficiency or inefficiency, but in fact it is, the Watson Library is the only academic building on campus named after a woman. And here we have Green Hall and the green statue that many of you are familiar with, dedicated in the mid-1920s, and Chancellor Lindley is the white-haired man in the center. Now there are some halls named after women, and Corbin Hall was the very first residence hall on campus. We finally have a time when we're able to house the students, and this is with support from the women's clubs of Kansas, and the fight for this residence hall was led by Alberta Corbin, who had an undergraduate from KU and her PhD from Yale, and she was the Dean of Women at KU from 1918 to 21 and went on to become a professor of German. Students could have fun. This is a popular photograph of bobsledding down the hill down to Potter Lake in 1928. And they even had ice cream trucks on campus, but what I want you to notice here is how fashionably the women are dressed. As well as here, this is a composite photo that was taken to compare classes in 1899 and 1920. And the women in front are wearing their furs and obviously having a good time. Now the 1930s, of course, brings the Great Depression. And how this affected KU students varied. They made fun of it by having Hobo Day. And this was a tradition for some time. You'll notice the student on the left is having a little kitten there. There are many pictures of Hobo Day. But also from the mid-1930s, we find these pictures of women from the Chi Omega sorority washing a Packard. So there were different realities. Tau Sigma was the women's dance troupe, and this is a pretty famous photograph many of you have seen, probably by Potters. But another view of women, the Women's Student Government Association from the 1930s. Another important thing that happened for students were the building of cooperatives or scholarship halls. This is Watkins and Miller Hall. We owe a lot to the generosity of Elizabeth Watkins, who gave not only these halls, she wanted a place for women, and eventually then men were also a part of this system who could not afford to be a part of for example, the fraternity or sorority system and had no other housing options. And Mrs. Watkins also gave our hospital, Watkins Memorial Hospital. This is 1932. This was the first freestanding hospital on a university campus. But other students did not fare so well, and the National Youth Administration activities provided on-campus jobs for students. About 500 students were able to be employed each year through this program through the mid-30s. Now, another interesting thing that happened in the 30s was a lot of concern about radicalism on the University of Kansas campus. From about 1925 through 1948, there was a newspaper called The Dove printed on this campus. It was usually printed on pink paper to aggravate people, I think. Actually, the leanings of the students who worked with it were probably merely liberal, radical. But in the fall of 1937, Don Henry, a former student and reportedly religious Boy Scout from Dodge City, Kansas, was killed in Spain. He was part of the Abe Lincoln Battalion fighting against the regime there. His father accused the university, accused the liberal arts dean, and accused the YMCA of really leading him to communism. And so both the Board of Regents and the legislators started investigative committees to find out what the heck was happening at KU. In fact, in the previous year, a chapter of the Young Communist League had formed on campus, but they think only about 15 to 20 students participated at all. So students on campus were very angry about the invasion and the suspicions of the legislative committee. And apparently what happened is they had their own anti-rally. Students had these red shirts made with the hammer and sickle, and they raised a red flag atop Fraser Hall. This is a picture of one of these students with the Kansas City Star reporter who came over to cover it. But the students were making fun of the concerns of the legislative committee. Incidentally, that committee did conclude the YMCA had some influence in this young man choosing to go to Spain to fight. And another aspect of the 1930s, here we have a dramatic club presentation of Emperor Jones. Of course, at this time, and there'll be more discussion about blacks in Lawrence and on the university, the students were acting in these productions, but only in plays specifically for blacks. And we find a transition time then with Ernest Lindley handing over the chancellorship to Dean Malott. And if we could have the next slides, please. This is in 1939. The 40s would bring many dramatic changes to the University of Kansas. Many of them circled around World War II. We find that in World War II by 1943, only about 10% of the student body at the University of Kansas were civilian men. So the rest were either already serving or were women. There were programs both, obviously a number of military programs both for Navy and for the women. Now I started out the decade here though to show you that students have protested in every decade and for different reasons. This is prior to the outbreak of the war. This is a downtown protest by KU students in 1941. They were demanding a holiday because KU had beaten K-State in football. Now I think this may be the way, folks, that we can get it done, so I encourage all the students to have a protest the next time we beat K-State in football. We find on World War II a big change, of course, on the campus. Navy training was very predominant. There were 500 naval engineering students who occupied fraternities. This is in front of Strong Hall. On the third floor of that building, there would have been military recruits housed there. Women got involved. There was a special aeronautical engineering technician program with Beech, Boeing, and Cessna. Malott called for a program, Every Woman in a War Course. The brochure about this war course shows a very beautiful woman, very attractive, with a bow in her hair and a slide rule in her hand. So they wanted the women to be involved as well. This group of soldiers marching on campus, and if you'll notice, there's only 2 cars visible with the restrictions. Now students could have fun too. One of the most popular student spots was a place called Dynamite, which is near 23rd in Louisiana, and you can see that most of the men dancing here in this photograph have military uniforms on, and toward the end of the war they continued their interest in dynamite. The biggest issue on campus after the war was simply the influx of students. Again, protesting. This is a veterans protest against housing shortages after the war, just to get some idea of what we're involved with here. In 44-45, the enrollment at the University of Kansas was 3,800. In 47-48, it was 10,900. It had tripled, and 6,500 of these students were veterans. So there was a huge impact on the campus and on Lawrence. All across Lawrence, people were asked to open their homes to these veterans who were returning. Men lived in the basements of Spooner and Robinson Gym and beneath the football stadium. Study halls and classes were held in buildings reclaimed from the government, in Quonset huts. We're still now just recently tearing down some of these Quonset huts. Another kind of interesting sidelight about construction after war, as some of you know, Danforth Chapel was partially built with the help of German POWs that were in a camp here in Lawrence. And of course, the memorial to those who lives in World War I is the Campanile. Here it's shown under construction in 1951, and this impressive picture of the bells as they're about to be installed. I love this picture because of the fashion statement these young men are making. I'm not really sure whether they're high school students or college students. I'm not sure if KU students would wear the letter sweaters, but they've got their car and they're ready to go. And these fashion statement by these women, this is a famous picture called 10 Campus Queens. There were so many different queens honored that they had to have a picture, and Chancellor Malott is in the background there. Now they find a change of leadership with Chancellor Murphy coming into the university. Here he is in the nightshirt parade. This is an interesting picture because Chancellor Murphy is on the left. On the right is Dean Lawrence Woodruff, who's wearing his freshman beanie. And in the center is a student named Jim Logan, who I understand went on to a federal judgeship. So you can wear your nightgown, get somewhere in the world. Of course, this 52 basketball win was extremely important, and I wanted to put this in here to show the happy face of both Chancellor Murphy and of Fog Allen, because toward the end of his tenure, Murphy's time here was not so happy. And this was because of this town gown conflict with Topeka, and specifically with Governor George Docking. Major conflict between the two of them, constant budget battles, the governor by his own hand approving or disapproving of faculty out-of-state travel, and finally Murphy had had enough and left in 1960 for UCLA. He was so well regarded by the students that 4,000 of them gathered in Hoke Auditorium to protest his leaving. But if you would have been back then trying to watch that Final Four game, you would have had to do it something like this. This was a picture of the students watching the game in the Kansas Union with the TVs present. And of course we were able to honor Wilton. Another important athletic star at KU, Billy Mills, attended Haskell University as well as the University of Kansas. And he won the gold at the 1964 Olympics in the 10,000 meter run. This is the picture of the track team that won the NCAAs in 1959. Billy Mills is on the upper left-hand corner there. It's hard to see this perhaps from your distance, but they've tried to make up for some of the people missing in this picture by inserting fake photographs in the background. And international students had a big role at the campus. And the other big change in the 1960s happened with building of residence halls. In 1946, we only had 455 rooms altogether for all of our students. By 1966, we housed 4,800 students. So all the building that happened on Daisy Hill in the 1960s, and here you see that development as well as the Stauffer apartments. But just one little note on our wonderful Fraser. This was our old Fraser in all its glory. The destruction of Fraser in 1965, students chained themselves to the building to protest its destruction. And finally, the new Fraser. And you can judge the progress for yourself. Just a little glance, and I know I'm running out of time, right? With the 60s, and we could talk a long time about the 60s, and you'll have a whole session on the 60s, but let me just give you a few visuals. This is the Red Dog Inn. I don't know is this the Frug? I'm sorry I don't know the name of this dance, but I should. I love this picture. That was at Red Dog Inn, which is Liberty Hall now. This is a very interesting picture here. On the young man's sweatshirt, it says, "Goodbye, class of '69. Hello, Mrs. Robinson." This is John Hill, the president of the senior class in 1969. So unless you think everyone was consumed with political protest, that's the wrong way to look at it. Now this, I put this one in for a personal reason. This is the Associated Women Students Fashion Show. This is in 1968. The young woman on the left was my roommate, and she was the first person that I met when I walked into University of Kansas in 1968, a green behind the ears, a young woman from western Kansas, and I was completely blown away because I had no idea that women looked like this, could wear clothes like this, and I was really stunned and felt completely out of place. And I was in a scholarship hall, so that's where we were. But there were many protests in the 60s, and the black students at this university led that protest and started that protest. This is a protest against exclusionary policies of fraternities and sororities. This is 1904. Most fraternities and sororities at this time did have exclusionary policies in their charters against blacks and in some cases against Jews. This will be talked about more, I'm sure, in the class, but the March 8th, 65 sit-in demonstration at the Chancellor's office by the Civil Rights Council. They protested discriminatory policies of housing, fraternities and sororities, the School of Education's restrictive policies on teacher placement. 110 students were arrested and suspended, but reinstated the next day, and this did lead to some significant changes. In this civil rights protest, you'll see Gail Sayers, the famous football player, on the right-hand side there with the sign. The chancellor of the time, I think, was probably more comfortable with rallies of this sort. This is Clark Wesco at a basketball rally in 1966. The next chancellor we see here, Lawrence Chalmers, at a Western Civ class at Ellsworth Hall in 1970. Even in those 2 years, a few things have changed, and notice the young man with no shoes. And here's another interesting picture of Chancellor Chalmers with then president of the student body, David Aubrey, now an editor or publisher of the Wichita Eagle, I believe, and Vice President Marilyn Bowman. The ROTC demonstration would lead to many significant things, and I hope this is discussed a little bit more in your class on the 60s. And many levels of Vietnam protests, this one in 1970, asking for peace now in 1969, but burning the Union in 1970 in April. And of course, we don't know still or yet who was responsible for that. I thought I would juxtapose that with a picture of, at least to think about it, Hoke burning in June 1991. But the 1960s was more than protest. I wanted to let you students here know that this is not a 60s costume party. This is the real thing, and this is how people really look. So, and we think this is a gumball machine by Potter Lake, which is pretty interesting. I'm not sure what it's doing there. The music scene on campus. There's a well-known art professor in this picture. I won't say more. And if you can pull this one in, this is where the 60s becomes the 70s. And now it's everyday garb for all the students on campus. And of course, women's rights becomes a bigger issue. The February Sisters in 1971 took over a building and held significant protests in regards to the rights and opportunities for women, women's studies, child care, and other key issues. But the gender issues continue. This is the streakers of 1973. They were frequent, and around the state of Kansas got a less about, again, KU going to hell in a handbasket with all the things happening. And then, of course, in 1979, this is Shenanigans, which existed as a dance place then, and Disco Rules in 1979. Just a final comment about the relationship of the University of Kansas and this town, and I have to kind of end it with a symbol, which is Joe's Bakery. This is a place, it's a tradition, it's an economic interaction. Both FMC workers and KU students stop here for hot donuts and cheap sandwiches. I just had a meeting with a student who I work with, who's a freshman, and her parents were undergraduates here, and the first thing they did when they brought her to Lawrence was take her to Joe's. So there are certain traditions that we have that cross that town gown border and make us aware of what the university is like. It may not be as fun as a May Day scrap, but a hot donut can be a substitute. And thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Daniel R. Wildcat, who is a member of the Yuchi tribe of Oklahoma and a native Kansan. He is professor of sociology at Haskell Indian Nations University, and he received a BA degree and MA degrees in sociology from the University of Kansas, and is currently completing an interdisciplinary PhD at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. Professor Wildcat is active in many national organizations of higher education, the National Indian Education Association, the Association of American Indian Professors, the American Indian Higher Education Consortium, and the North Central Association of Colleges and Schools. Professor Wildcat has been very instrumental in furthering understanding between racial and ethnic groups in the Midwest. In 1992, he was honored with the Hart Peace Award by the Kansas City organization The Future Is Now for his efforts to promote world peace and cultural diversity. Professor Wildcat recently helped plan an American Indian educational program to celebrate the 25th anniversary of Earth Day. As a part of that program, Professor Wildcat moderated a live national telebroadcast dialogue between traditional American Indian elders and American Indian scientists and engineers about the way we must live in order to ensure that our children will inherit a healthy planet. Professor Wildcat's lecture this evening is titled Indian Education, a Revolution Underway at Haskell Indian Nations University. Dan, thanks for coming.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to keep this presentation somewhat informal in terms of my presentation and your ability to ask questions. And so what I'd like to propose we do is that I'm going to sort of tell you a story. It's a story that in many ways is very appropriate for this course because I was thinking about it. It really just occurred to me earlier today that it's sort of about a contested terrain. It's about a part of Lawrence, a place in Lawrence. Lawrence has never, I think, fully known how to integrate into its history. Some of that's a history of marginalization. It's a history that really has to be painted on a canvas, very large canvas of the United States, of federal Indian policy, and consequently, I was thinking that it would be, if I were going to rename the lecture, I'd call it Haskell Indian Nations University, a contested terrain. Symbolically, it's been a contested terrain in the context of Indian education and what that meant. Now, literally, our campus has become a contested terrain in terms of the South Lawrence Trafficway, which you read about a little bit in the readings that you were assigned. So I'm going to paint a picture. It's going to be an impressionistic picture. It's going to be one that won't allow me to go into a lot of details, but the trick will be, I think, to give you a sort of an image of Haskell's history and how it relates to the city of Lawrence, and paint it with fairly broad brush strokes, but hopefully the advantage is you'll get a bigger picture, a fuller image of what Haskell Indian Nations University is about. And I think in order to accomplish that, I'd like to entertain that when I discuss something or mention something that you'd like to stop or it's appropriate you feel like to get a clarification. Believe it or not, students sometimes tell me I'm not perfectly clear all the time. So stop me and I'll entertain your questions and we can have a dialogue. I know we have time set aside at the end of the presentation for that, but I'll feel much more comfortable if have sort of an exchange here tonight. A contested terrain. Well, let's start with the big picture. I'm going to paint it with broad brush strokes, and I think it will hopefully fit with some of the other education you've received. Kind of thinking about comparing a view, there are a lot of ways to present history. You can think of it as chronology. I like to think of it as place, the history of a place. And it's very symbolic in some ways that the longest standing intertribal, federally funded institution of American Indian education is right here in the center of the 48 contiguous states of the United States. I mean, the place, that being the place where Haskell Institute, even before that, the United States Industrial Indian Training School was created in 1884. Only later, I think within the first year, named after Dudley C. Haskell, a Kansas congressman who had a lot to do with that place being set aside for the education of American Indians. And you can't understand what was going on at Carlisle, at Hampton, at Haskell, at Chilocco. These are all boarding schools, off-reservation Indian boarding schools run by the United States government. You can't understand that unless you put it in the context of 19th century American history. The United States policy relative to the indigenous persons of these United States. And so again, it's somewhat simplistic, but I don't think it misses the point. I don't think it's too wide to suggest that Indian education, when that became the liberal call for solving the Indian problem, to understand, just in the minds of the dominant society, how liberal that solution was. You have to understand what the earlier two solutions to the Indian problem were to understand how liberal this was. The earlier, the first two solutions, and we're talking about 19th century, 1800, 1900. First solution was basically geographical removal. And consequently, that explains why the Wyandots ended up in Kansas, why the Kickapoos, the Potawatomis ended up in Kansas, why my relatives, the Uchis, ended up along with the Creeks, the Choctaws, Chickasaws, the Cherokees, and the Seminoles in Oklahoma, because their Jacksonian presidency, the solution to the Indian problem was going to be real easy. We just push them west, push them out of our way, remove them. Of course, the Cherokee, everyone's familiar of the so-called Cherokee Trail of Tears, but I want to let you know that just about every tribe that was removed from the East has a Trail of Tears story. The Potawatomi, the Kickapoo to some degree, the Wyandots, all of those tribes, the Ottawa, all of those tribes that ended up, the Seneca, all those tribes that ended up being pushed from their homes to this, at that time, the western frontier, to the edge of the Great Plains, they had their trails of tears, their stories to tell. That was going to be the solution of the Indian problem. And of course, it was short-lived. It was short-lived because really the Civil War built up of a substantial army, of military capability, and people began to think of opening up the West, this go west young man kind of ideology. After the Civil War, people wanted to homestead, people wanted a place to call their own, and guess what? Those ended up to be the places that they had removed native peoples to in the 1820s, the 1830s, the 1840s. And so there was some friction there. But there were still these tremendous tribes that after, Plains tribes, that after contact with the Spanish had quickly found a use for the horse, developed horsemanship that unconventional by European standards, but was quite appropriate technology for them to use in the ways they used it. And you had Lakota, Dakota, Crow, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Apache, Caddo to the south. You had these people who this Great Plains was, this was their home. And the problem was we had people who wanted to build railroads, and we had people who wanted to go west right through their homes, right through their backyards. And of course, along the way, they wanted to disrupt the patterns of the animals, the migrations, the movements of animals that they depended on. And of course, that's a well-known story. I mean, into the buffalo herds and all of that. What's probably not fully realized is that it was fairly clear after the Civil War that there were people in the War Department who argued that, well, we really need to really solve the Indian problem. It's here again because we've moved to where we pushed them. We decided we want that too. And so, and then there were some people who had been there for a very long time, Plains Indians. And so the second solution was going to be attempted. And you can be, I think, if you wanted to be diplomatic, you could say it was going to be a military subjugation. It was going to be a solving the Indian problem by, military tactics. If you wanted to be less diplomatic, you could say, I think legitimately, there were a number of people who felt the only good Indian was a dead Indian. And so nothing short of genocide would be acceptable. And this is the period where we had documented cases. Historians have done the work on it of, the smallpox-infected blankets being given to Indians, contaminated food being given to native peoples. And so, ultimately, again, the good Indian's the dead Indian. Well, naturally, there were a number of Americans who didn't find that very palatable. And so that second solution, this military subjugation solution, was fortunately short-lived. The battle at the Little Bighorn had something to do with that, I think. Probably they found out that maybe this military subjugation and domination wasn't going to be quite as easy as they had anticipated. And so you get an incredible mix of people, no less than Harriet Beecher Stowe, meeting at Lake Mohonk in New York State, starting conferences, really about the time Haskell was formed in the 1880s, all through the 1890s, through at least the first decade of the 20th century. And they came up with the classic liberal solution to social problems, education. See, the problem is that, they misunderstood the problem. The problem, it wasn't going to be feasible to push all the Indians into the Pacific Ocean. It wasn't going to be feasible to kill them all. So the solution to the Indian problem was what we'll do is we will educate them, we will civilize them, and if we civilize them, completely culturally assimilate, what we will have is brown-skinned or red-skinned non-natives. They won't really be Indians anymore. They'll be like we are, civilized in the dominant society. And then they can be fully integrated into American society and empowered, and so on and so forth. Well, this is the contested terrain I alluded to, symbolically, metaphorically, where I want to begin with Haskell's history. Indian education, until very recently, how recently would I say? I'd say the last 3 decades. I'd say really, you have to really give some credit to the Red Power, to the American Indian movement, with basically putting this on the front burner and saying, education ought not be just education services for American Indian boys and girls, young people, young adults. If it's truly going to be Indian education, or as I like to say, indigenous education, North American indigenous education, it has to be indigenized. Well, that kind of thinking was nowhere in anyone's mind in the 1880s, the 1890s, and I'd argue with very few exceptions until the late 1960s. That recently. And so when I'm looking at pictures of KU and how it started on the hill and everything, imagine an institution that's created where children are arriving when they're 4 or 5, 6 years old. Remember, the notion here of education was going to be very practically oriented. So the main goal, when Haskell opened, it had grades 1 through 5. Again, the age range might be tremendous. I mean, granted, there might be, 17 or 18-year-olds in a third, fourth, or fifth grade class, needing to know basic math and reading and the like. But completely focused on agriculture. We're going to make these young men and women, they're going to be future farmers, okay, and the women will be homemakers. So they learn the requisite skills to make a home in the way that it was thought of in the dominant society. And you guys have probably seen some pictures. I was really thinking in hindsight, seeing Kathy's beautiful pictures and everything. Gee, I should put some pictures together. But the before and after shots of children arriving in their beautiful traditional dress, buckskins, blankets, their hair in braids, and the first thing they did was issue them military-style uniforms and cut their hair. And these were prized photos to show people back east. See what we've done? I mean, this is after day one. They came in looking like this, and we've done this, and they are on the road to civilization. They're literally marching towards civilization. Most people don't realize the regiment at Haskell was very military-oriented. The guy who started had a big hand in the philosophy of Carlyle, and Hampton Institute was an ex-military officer, Pratt. I'm blocking on his first name. Pratt, who had this idea for starting this system of education. And today some of you may have heard social scientists talk about the notion of a total institution that shapes a person. That's what these were. These were total institutions targeted towards education of American Indian boys and girls, which meant basically complete cultural assimilation or acculturation. There was no notion, Hampton Institute, I'm paraphrasing here, above the door, Hampton Institute, destroy the Indian to save the man. It was your very nativeness as a Kiowa person, as a Comanche person, as a Creek person, as a Lakota, as a Pawnee, as a Cree, as a Crow, as a Cheyenne. It was that was your obstacle to realizing your true humanity. I mean, we think of that now and we go, my God, what was going on? Well, I want to point out this was the liberal solution to the Indian problem in the day. There were a lot of people who had other solutions in mind. That's the beginning of Haskell Institute. And it's been a contested terrain probably in the history of American education, symbolically. Haskell sort of on the edge of Lawrence, I think in some ways is an interesting, there's kind of a spatial metaphor there. How many of you in this room have been to Haskell? Okay, I'm glad. About half. Maybe a little over half. That's good. I still am amazed at the number of people I meet in Lawrence who've never been on the campus. And for a lot of reasons, they're kind of fearful. They don't really quite know what to expect out there. They know that's a school for Indians and Alaska Natives, but are we welcome? Or is that like a reservation? Maybe we shouldn't even be there, No, I've heard people tell me this. They didn't know, Now that says something about a place that's marginalized, I'd submit to you. Places sort of off limits, it's hard to negotiate, how, I don't know, is it all right to go down there and watch Haskell football games? I know I can go watch, at least be able to go watch Lawrence High games, still go watch Lawrence High games, but is it all right to go to a Haskell football game or basketball game? Amazing. Well, that ought to tell you something. That ought to tell you something about history, about an ongoing struggle. And what I would say is a revolution that's going on now at Haskell. It's a quiet one. It's not one of these that we're going to see necessarily students in the streets, although we'll talk about that a little later towards my talk. It may see students protesting over a road. It's already happened. I'm sure it will continue to happen. We'll see how that unfolds. But what's happening and what's happened over Haskell's history of, some 113 years is basically just in the last 2 decades, I'd say, at our institution. I would assess it that. Some of my colleagues might differ with me. Haskell's finally begun to indigenize the education process, to make education have something at a foundational level about indigenous worldviews, beliefs, values, language, music, customs, and habit that really are what identifies people culturally with who they are. That recent. It's no longer just an institution for the education of Indians along some sort of dominant, notion or educational philosophy. And I'd say that's pretty radical. That's revolutionary. A lot of it, we're not even sure exactly what we're doing or how we're going to do it, but that's part of it too. You just do it. Just kind of muddle through and make mistakes and get really excited about the things that are going on there now. That's why I wanted you to read when Dennis talked to me about, well, what could we read? We kind of kicked it around for a while, and I thought, well, I don't want to do just a straight history as chronology. So I thought, let's do this response that the university, an interdisciplinary team at the university put together when we finally had the opportunity to address the proposed South Lawrence Trafficway. And we wrote a document called All Things Are Connected, and we decided when we drafted that we were going to use an indigenous perspective to frame our objections. That in our mind, it doesn't really make good sense to separate political and ethical and moral and economic issues because those things are always related. It's convenient to say, oh no, that's an economic issue, that's an ethical issue, or that's about this over here or that there, but those distinctions are largely artificial in our experience. I mean, the way we live involves that we constantly thinking about many aspects that we might label, different things categorically: an ethical issue, a spiritual issue, an educational issue, a cultural issue. And so we decided we'd title our response, All Things Are Connected, to begin to suggest, there's another way of looking at the world. And from an indigenous standpoint, we can't really agree with this proposal to put this traffic way on this 31st Street alignment through these wetlands, because we look at that very differently than the way your engineers or your developers or your planners do. We understand it differently. We experience it differently. And so that really came out, the fact that we could write that document that way collectively, several of us, members of the administration, other faculty, get together and sort of put those kinds of things together was really kind of an affirmation. Hey, we're doing it. I mean, we can talk about these things. We can articulate this worldview. So let me kind of fill in the gap between that beginning 1884 and where we're at today in 1997 by suggesting one of the things we could do. It is sort of interesting. It'd be an interesting comparison to look at KU and Haskell together, because I'm thinking about, these periods. I met a woman in Lawrence about 3 years ago who came up to me after a presentation I had done, and she said, my mother was a student in 1918 during the flu epidemic. They shut down school here, I think, for a number of weeks. They just told the students who were well enough to go home. Her mother did not have enough money to go home. And her mother, they found out that they needed assistance down at Haskell Institute. There was no consideration there of shutting down. This was the home for these children. And so her mom went down to work at Haskell and helped take care of sick children down there. And she said when she left that they had given her a blanket. And she still had this blanket. And it was obvious it meant a lot to her. But this was her mother had been a student at KU, the flu epidemic of 1918. She couldn't go home, so she went to Haskell to help the students. At Haskell, we weren't worried about beating K-State. We were too busy kicking the pants off Dartmouth, Yale, Harvard, Army, Navy. Yeah, people like Thorpe, John Levi. I mean, you talk about sports in the 1920s and early 30s. KU was an also-ran. But you check out the New York Times, you check, I don't know what it was, probably one of the Times, whatever the major New York papers were, Chicago, San Francisco, they carried the football scores about Haskell Institute. And Haskell Institute usually ended up on top. John Levi, again, a fascinating person in the 30s. How many of you know who John Levi is? Rhonda, you know. A few of you here. John Levi is fascinating because it's kind of like that what you miss in the way we present history sometimes. John Levi may have been the greatest living athlete of all time, because he's the one that Jim Thorpe said. His comment about Levi was, gee, I wish I could throw the ball and kick the ball like John Levi. Apparently, some of this is hard to separate. The lore, kind of lore and legend from fact. I mean, I don't know. There may be some people still living who saw this, but there's a story, and I've heard a lot of Haskell old-timers tell it, but I don't know, where do you kick off from in a football game? The 20-yard line, 30-yard line, something like that. There's a story that at halftime at a football game in Haskell that John Levi got at one end of the football field, Jim Thorpe got at the other, and they practiced kicking field goals from where you kick off at. Unbelievable. I mean, incredible. Incredible histories. One of the biggest events to ever occur in Haskell was when they opened it. If you ever go by there, you can see that art stadium. Haskell had the first lighted football stadium. Why? We had the best football team in the state. That's why. That when that arch was built, most of the funds for that stadium a lot of the funds came from Osage tribe of Oklahoma. They were rolling in oil money by that time. This would have been, I think that must have been 27 or 28, 1927 or 28. And the curator, I'm blocking on his name, at the Douglas County Museum, Steve Jensen, he does an excellent presentation about that whole soiree they had. Tribes came from all over the United States when they did the opening of that stadium, and that that big arch, that grand arch there at the west end, and Osage tribe paid for water. There was no running water, like public utilities running from the city, and they paid to have water lines, temporary ones, run out there, and the reports over 100 teepees erected. People from all over the United States coming to Haskell to celebrate this. Native people. Unbelievable. And yet, it's a history that's not very well known in Lawrence, generally speaking. kind of on the edge out there. Well, by 1927, and this kind of matches up with what Kathy was saying, Haskell didn't even have an accredited secondary education program. It was one of these 1 through 8 things with a normal school. By the way, Haskell was the first institution, American Indian institution, that had a normal school. That was 1885. And primarily young Indian women were trained to be teachers, and in a normal program that they had there, but didn't really even have an accredited secondary program till 1927. And in 1927 they had an accredited secondary program, and Haskell's really reputation nationally began to be recognized as one in what we would call today vocational education, mechanics. Remember, a lot had happened between 1884 and 1927, and by 1927 you didn't so much need blacksmiths as you needed mechanics. And so Haskell started mechanics program, had building trades, and all of these things that were at the time denominated voc ed. And really, between the Second World War and the First World War, the guiding philosophy of all of Indian education per se was the motto in Haskell. The old-timers at Haskell still tell you that what they learned at Haskell was they learned to earn. That was the idea. It almost sounds like kind of the debates between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. I mean, very much with Indian education on this voc ed problem. What Indians need, they don't need to be necessarily doctors or professions. What they need is to be able to make a living and support a family and integrate into the mainstream of American society. And so by 1927, accredited secondary program with a strong voc ed emphasis. 1935, we got an accreditation to do a post-secondary voc ed certificate programs. These were certificates. You get certificate in welding or auto mechanics or building trades or whatever. And that was really Haskell's sort of claim to fame clear up until 1970. Another benchmark, 1962, okay. 1962, the emphasis really changed from even secondary education to a commitment to post-secondary vocational education, technical education. The last high school class graduated in 1965 in Haskell. That was the learn to earn period. And it's a fascinating period between the First and Second World Wars because so much was going on. Remember that when the First World War occurred, American Indians or indigenous peoples, again, people are going to ask me, why does he always say American Indian? Why not Native peoples or something? Well, it's a whole nother discussion. But remember that when the First World War occurred, my grandparents were not citizens of the United States. They were citizens of the Muskogee Nation. The Uchis have always been misidentified as Creeks. That's another interesting story, but first time the government's been wrong about something. But we've been politically a part of the Muskogee Nation. We're not Creek. We've never been Creek, but in the eyes of the United States government, you're Creek. They know we're Yuchi. Zoyaha, Uchiha. Anyway, in that period, you had American Indians becoming citizens. You had basically this whole sort of move of blacks out of the poor South and North. I mean, it was beginning earlier, but that continued on through that period, okay? And you began to see the second and in some cases the third generations of young Native men and women who were products of these boarding schools, who were really looking at, moving in areas and making their way, fully matriculating or, into the mainstream of American society. Like everyone else, go where the jobs. You go where the jobs are. You don't go back home if there's not any jobs. You go where the jobs are. Okay? Interesting contradictions, irony in this period. Some of you remember John Collier, who probably until very recently has been viewed as again, a sort of, on the Indian side, head of BIA, Bureau of Indian Affairs. Collier worked as a superintendent in Indian schools in the 20s and came up with the radical idea that, guess what, I think we ought to let Native people have more of a say in the policies we're developing. And he started something that became known as the Howard Wheeler Act, sometimes just called the Indian Reorganization Act, became law in 1934, and this is when the government designed notions of what representative democracy ought to be in Native communities and among tribes and nations was developed and sanctioned, again, ironically, by the federal government, and it was viewed as, again, a fairly liberal idea, How liberal? Well, this is interesting. Remember now, we've had all these children who have been going through these government schools and often with a heavy dose of one denomination or another of Christianity, literally structured into the curriculum, This the Baptists, the Presbyterians, the Episcopalians, the Catholics. Of course, the Catholics and the Protestants just in general had an ongoing fight between about 1885 until about 1915 over, who really was getting what in terms of resources to do Indian education. But incredible ironies in this period. I one time got interested in Collier's legacy, and so I went back, and just as the Bureau does today, when they have proposals, they often have these public hearings where they'll go to areas to get public input, and Rapid City, Albuquerque, Minneapolis, Salt Lake. So I wanted to see what kind of input, because I kind of thought, well, maybe, generally, gee, the tribes must have saw this, but self-determination, we're going to have our own tribal councils, our own government. And I remember looking at the reports, the actual recordings of the public comment for the public hearing that was held in Rapid City, South Dakota, and I was shocked when I heard Collier being attacked as a red, as a pinko, and as Indians saying they weren't interested in communism. I'm going like, gee, where did this come from? And I remembered, I know where it came from. The people who were making those objections were products of United States Indian boarding schools. And they knew anything. They had these radical notions, non-hierarchical notions of power and right and wrong and participation and democracy must be communist. And yeah, we had professors at institutions like KU and all over the country, I'm sure, for basically arguing for democratic principles losing their jobs. Well, these products of Indian education were now arguing against Collier's attempt to create some mechanism for participation. I found that really ironic. At one level, I found it really ironic, and at another level, I said, man, they did a good job. They did a good job. But there were some unintended consequences too. There were latent consequences the same time too, the same time. This is one of the contradictory things when you start looking and interviewing people who were at boarding schools in those times. And you know, most people that lived through those times, they don't remember the really bad stuff. And probably it's too painful to remember this stuff. Like where my building in the hall, we used to have basically, you know, for lack of a better term, a little jail cell there. It was for detention, where students who might be caught breaking the rules, such as speaking their native language, which was absolutely unacceptable. You lose a day's meals or a night in your dorm and get put in this basically, it was a cell. I mean, it had bars and on the windows and a door, and so you got put there for a 12-hour, 24-hour period, you know, in the interest of killing the Indian but saving the human being. That's pretty painful stuff to think about. I've seen adults I know shed tears when they have to talk about some of those experiences. Painful. So what do they remember? What's the unintended consequence? There was again a very interesting unintended consequence. Guess what? You got Native people from all over the country together in these institutions. They made friendships. They began to recognize. They began to identify across tribal lines, across different cultural lines and geographic lines. And we have a lot of students now who are products of Haskell romances, Chilocco romances. I mean, like, gee, how do you get a Pawnee and a Lakota student together? I mean, this isn't exactly natural loved ones, you know, on the plains. Well, their parents were at Haskell. They were at Chilocco. They were at Riverside. They were at Bacone, northeastern Oklahoma. You got these intertribal marriages. You got this identification. Guess what? We may have strength in recognizing an identity as Native peoples that's much broader, a more collective identity, politically, culturally. That hadn't been planned on. But by the time we got out of by the time we moved past the Second War and the Korean War, guess what? Some of those students, like Dennis Banks, anthropology student, Lakota student, University of California, Berkeley, a whole range of students whose parents had been in the boarding schools, but guess what? They had learned above and beyond what the intended goal was. And that was, hey, you know, you got to do more than learn to earn. You know, we need American Indian professors. We need American Indian doctors. We need American Indian engineers. And so there were parents that were encouraging their sons and daughters to go to universities. And people started studying stuff like American Indian law. Now, granted, that's still basically law about American Indians. That's changing, though. We've got, you know, people who are scholars, American Indian legal scholars, like Vine Deloria and Clifford Little and Sam Deloria and Walter Echo Hawk and John Echo Hawk and Greg Bigler and, you know, a number of people, you know, who are saying, guess what? If we have the power to make our own legal systems, maybe we ought to examine the principles under which we set up a legal system, because, you know, some of the principles that we've inherited from this Anglo-Saxon, predominantly Anglo-Saxon notion of precedent and property, maybe those really aren't, maybe they just don't work that well maybe we can come up with an indigenous. Let's go back and look at the way our ancestors did things. Let's look at our ceremonies, our stories, our oral traditions. What do we have there that might give us a key that there's another way of looking at the world, another way of organizing, how you might do a legal system or a political system? Indigenize your legal system. And so we talk about that at Haskell. I mean, we're doing this. I mean, we're engaged in that. And it's incredible. It's absolutely incredible. And again, most people in Lawrence probably don't really have a clue. They know it's still just a school for, American Indians. But we've got incredible students there now that it's going to be interesting to see what they go out and do. Self-determination, sovereignty. We graduated the last high school class in 1965, went to post-secondary voc ed, started as a junior college in 1970, accredited in 1972, and 1993, about the time I've been at Haskell since January of 1986. And about that time, this discussion was starting. Why are we just offering 2-year programs? Why aren't we doing 4-year programs? Why don't we have our own teacher ed program? Why don't we have our own business program? After all, I mean, you can learn business management at KU's School of Business, but I think if you started talking about tribal management and the technicalities and the ins and outs and the unique aspects of federal tribal relations and self-determination and said, hey, could you guys at KU do us a course on that? What are you talking about? Well, we know what we're talking about. I mean, that's where people live. These issues, termination, sovereignty. That's where we live. And so that debate started, and it was painful. It was painful for a number of reasons. It was painful because we knew if we were going to move to a university, it meant that we were going to not be able to continue the kind of voc ed programs we had: auto body, auto mechanics, welding, electronics. We just couldn't continue. I mean, you can't do everything. And so we had to look at, well, is it feasible for us to maybe cut out those programs? And I want to tell you that cutting out those programs was a really tough debate. And a lot of our alumni who were products, learn to earn programs, they had gone on like my dad did. My dad didn't go to Haskell, but he went to Chilocco in north central Oklahoma and learned a trade as a printer before he went to the Pacific in the Second World War as a Marine. When he came back, he got his first job working for the Coffeyville Journal in Coffeyville, Kansas. That's where he met my mom. My mom's not native. She's about as Anglo as you can get. Maiden name's Andrews. And met my mom, fell in love, and my brother and I came along shortly thereafter and grew up there, and then moved to Tulsa and then back to Coffeyville. And there's a whole generation of people like my dad who they're grateful for what Chilocco and what Haskell gave them, because they look at us and they say, well, it couldn't have been all bad, They look at their children. And it really is in my family. It's that generation. It's my cousins. It's my cousins. It's all of my cousins who have been, University of Wisconsin, New Mexico University, Harvard University, Harvard Law School. And so when we started saying, well, we're going to cut out these voc ed programs, a lot of them kind of took it personal, like, well, gee, what's wrong with being a welder or a bricklayer or a carpenter? And we were trying to say, there's nothing wrong with that, but what's wrong with having doctors and lawyers and engineers and scientists? And, you know, we just don't have the resources to do all of it. And that was a tough debate at our institution about that. The one that sort of was the bedrock, the same throughout the debates, was we said the criteria we're going to use on our decision is going to be how are we going to empower Native communities. And ultimately, the Board of Regents and people at Haskell, faculty, staff, students had a little say, but like most institutions, the students aren't always very empowered to really have a voice in those kinds of decisions. But the decision was made. We're going to move towards a baccalaureate granting status, maybe someday offering master's degrees, maybe doctorates. And the bedrock in that was, this is the way Haskell at least can serve Native people the best. It also gave us the opportunity to really look at developing courses in indigenous philosophy, a notion of indigenous law, ethics, environmental science. I always tease all of my friends, people have heard me say this before, have heard me speak on issues about the wetlands and stuff. I said, ecology is only a new science in the Western tradition. For indigenous peoples, the notion that you have to study the relations of everything to really understand it, that's the first foundation of our philosophy. You know, evolution's controversial in the Western tradition. Change is an accepted part of the world in Native traditions. You want to call that evolution? We have stories about change. Some of it gradual, some of it very dramatic. So I say, well, you know, in some ways I'm glad to see that Western science is catching up with traditional indigenous wisdom. So we do this, we talk about this stuff when we teach environmental science courses. We talk about this when we look at a course in tribal economics. Because if you think about that worldview I just suggested, the things that most mainstream economists call externalities aren't external for us at all. That's the most bogus concept. I mean, the notion that you would say, well, those aren't really we're just looking at the narrow economics. You're raising all these externalities about what the effect might be on the wetlands and the plants and the animals on the wetlands. And we're saying, but how convenient for you to marginalize that. And now, so we've got this revolution going on at Haskell. And I don't think people in Lawrence really knew about it. And so the South Lawrence Traffic Way comes along, and they think everything's pro forma. You know, we'll do things kind of the way we've always done things. And a few people will get together, and they'll decide what ought to be done. And no one really thought about contacting Haskell. Just got left out. It was an oversight. And then when they brought their proposal to us, they seemed very disturbed that we had a lot of problems with it. Now I mean collectively now. I'm not, I can't speak for the institution. I wouldn't dare do it. Okay, it's not my place. But faculty, staff, students, members of the administration, Board of Regents, I mean, we've publicly gone on record. We don't like that proposal. And then we had the opportunity to explain why, and when we had the opportunity, we chose to write all things are connected as a statement that said, guess what? There's another way of evaluating proposals like this traffic way. And we think we've got a pretty good way of evaluating it. And that it's just as meaningful, maybe more meaningful, at least it's more meaningful to us as native peoples when we consider this proposal, because we don't think you can mitigate the damage. I have trouble believing that human beings are going to make a better wetland than what the Creator and this Mother Earth have done. Right? Make something that kind of looks like a wetland, but it takes a long time to create these systems. Now, that's not a pristine area. It's been used by human beings for a long time. I don't want to make that argument. All I want you to think about is, as you continue here for the next couple of years as students, if you haven't been to Haskell Indian Nations University, make it a point to come down there. Just come down there and walk around. It's not against the law. You can do that. You won't be arrested. And I feel like Lawrence ought to be a part of. I feel like Haskell ought to be an incredible part of Lawrence history. It's ironic to me, though, now that after I talked about this symbolic contested terrain, now literally we've become a contested. And in some ways, I'd pose it to you this way. It is a collision of worldviews, of beliefs and values. All we're asking is that people try to respect our beliefs, our values. Maybe even try to understand them and learn something from them. That's why we wrote All Things Are Connected. And I want to thank you for being very attentive, and I hope you've got questions, because I've been getting this flash sign here, time's up. So I'm going to stop now and entertain questions that you might have or comments.